Hello and welcome to the Periphery from the Pulaski Institution. I am your host, Alan Elrod. Today, we're doing another one of our conversations off of our 50 Takes on Democracy series. And this time, we are talking to Dr. Alex Middlewood of Wichita State. Her piece is titled Kansas is Bleeding But Not Broken, Disintegrating Democracy in the Free State. And Dr. Middlewood is an assistant professor of political science at Wichita State University. Her areas of specialization include gun politics, public opinion, political behavior, civic engagement, and gender. And her research focuses on the political participation and attitudes of American gun owners. She's also a policy fellow at the Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Fort Hays State University and a member of Insight Kansas. Alex, we're really happy to have you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought that the first thing we could do is just say, this piece dropped late June of last year for us. So I'm curious, just in the intervening time, obviously we had a midterm election. Kansas had a pretty big referendum. Other things have happened. If you want to give us kind of both the quick lay of the land of how things stood for you then and how now things have maybe changed a little in your analysis since the piece first came out.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the piece, when I wrote it, there were a couple of major issues that I talk about throughout it, particularly the disintegration of home rule, a partisan supermajority in the state legislature, lack of competitive electoral districts, and challenges to ballot accessibility. And those are all of the greatest concern to democracy here in Kansas. And we've actually seen some more contemporary examples, even since then, of really each of these different issues. So when it comes to disintegration of home rule, we have seen that after the August 2nd primary election last year, in which there was a ballot amendment on the Kansas ballot, which would have allowed the state legislature to regulate abortion services, which are currently protected under the Kansas state constitution from a Kansas Supreme Court decision made in 2019. That amendment failed with an overwhelming majority. It failed by 18 points. And one of the first things we've seen the state legislature do is introduce new bills this current legislative session that would undermine that vote. And one of those bills that has been introduced would actually allow cities and localities to regulate abortion services. And so while this is a little bit of a return to home rule, it does directly undermine what Kansas voters said and made their voices heard last August. And so currently under the Kansas state constitution, their cities and localities are not allowed to regulate abortion. It is a power that the state legislature held for themselves. And the original intent of that law was to keep some of the more liberal or progressive cities from legalizing abortion or having less restrictions on it than the state wanted to have. And the bill that's been introduced to repeal that would really just create more of this power struggle or this tug of war between the state and local governments, and continue this struggle that we've seen over the last couple of years. We also continue to see a partisan supermajority in the state legislature. Laura Kelly is a Democratic governor. She was labeled one of the most precarious Democrats on the ballot last year. She was successful, however, in winning re-election, but yet Kansas voters did re-elect a supermajority to the state legislature. And so there is a supermajority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate. And a large reason for that was a lack of competitive electoral districts. We did see a couple of districts, particularly in Johnson County, which is those Kansas City suburbs, flip from Republican to Democrat. But we saw about the same number flip from Democrat to Republican in other areas of the state. And the large reason for that is partisan redistricting that Kansas went through, like many states did last year. And then we did see some challenges to ballot accessibility last year. Not too much came out of that. So that would be the one issue that I addressed that we haven't really seen too much change since I wrote this piece last summer.
Okay, that's a great overview, a lot that we can unpack in that. So first, I think I want to dig into, can you, I think for listeners, explain a little more the dynamics of home rule in Kansas, the kind of not just the particularities of it, which I think would be really helpful, but also the ways it's being challenged and kind of how that fight breaks down, the different kind of groups that are working maybe for preserving home rule and the groups that are kind of working to perhaps undermine it.
Yeah, so in Kansas, we're a little bit unique in that we actually have a constitutional amendment in our state constitution that guarantees home rule. And this has been in place since 1961. And this means that Kansans, at least in 1961, when they voted for this constitutional amendment, they had a preference for their local governments rather than the state to make decisions for their communities. And this really allows for a smaller level of government. It allows for government to be closer to the people, and to pass laws and put it policies and administer policies that are a better fit for their individual communities. And so we have a really long history of this in Kansas. For a state that doesn't have that many people in it, we actually have 105 counties. Um, and so we have this long history of just liking local levels of government, all the way from when our counties were put in place to 1961, when home rule was established in the Constitution, and still today. And so we have seen really strong kind of populist movements in Kansas. And when I say populist today, we tend to think of right wing populism like we see in Europe. But for a long period of Kansas history, we actually saw more leftist populism as well. But there's this really strong political value of populism and individualism where government, yes, is important, but individual rights are also important. And if we're going to have government, then it should be a smaller level of government, and it should be closer to the people to better make decisions that can actually fit with the communities themselves, and put issues and policies in place that are just a better fit for that community. And so we see this really long history of that in Kansas. And this includes all sorts of local and government affairs, anything from, taxes, to policies. Some of the recent examples last year that we saw, the state legislature regulating because cities were trying to do these things. We saw sanctuary cities being talked about in some of our cities, and then banning things like plastic bags and single-use plastics, et cetera. And so different parts of the state have really used home rule in different ways. The COVID-19 pandemic is a really good example of this, where you had some particularly rural counties that really didn't have a ton of COVID cases, especially early on, wanted the ability to regulate that for themselves. Whereas some of the more populated counties wanted to be able to regulate that after the state had dropped all restrictions because they had COVID running rampant. And so it really allows, particularly in this case, counties and cities to make decisions that are best for their populations. And that really stems all throughout Kansas history. And we just have this really long history of having smaller government to be able to better represent their individual citizens.
So I'm curious with something like sanctuary cities, because the COVID issue makes a ton of sense to me. But with something like sanctuary cities, how much of that is a real dynamic in Kansas politics, and how much of that is sort of just bringing national conversation into Kansas politics in a way that's rhetorically useful, right? But maybe doesn't actually track on to map onto to reality, right? Are there significant efforts among Kansas's urban centers to operate in this way, or is this more just a talking point that works well because of nationalized politics?
So the answer in Kansas is both. So we do have a tendency to see the state legislature localizing national issues, where if anyone who's listening was paying attention or was in Kansas last election season, we saw all sorts of political ads about national issues that really didn't have much effect here in Kansas, or really weren't being talked about. In this specific instance, we did see Wyandotte County which is right outside of Kansas City, that northern county outside of the Kansas City suburbs, was talking about sanctuary cities and was actually looking into putting this in place. They had a border commission that was put in place to kind of discuss this in that county. And so in that specific instance, the state legislature passed that law specifically in response to Wyandotte County. We also see kind of another similar example where in Johnson County, which is just south of Wyandotte County, again, one of those Kansas City suburb counties, they were having some issues last year with their sheriff. And the state legislature's response to that was to put a ballot amendment on the November ballot that would regulate how sheriffs can be elected and removed from office. So usually when we see laws like this coming out of the Kansas legislature, it's in response to one or two particular issues and not because it's a widespread issue across the state. And usually there's some partisan elements there as well.
I think it's helpful that you're also identifying some of the these actual urban centers in Kansas, because I don't think I think most Americans would probably they would think Kansas City, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how much they would think of maybe anywhere else as like an urban center. And to be fair, it is an interesting dynamic because Kansas is full of a lot of these kinds of mid-sized cities that are places I would assume that may not have been as traditionally perhaps liberal as bigger cities in America, but that are probably getting pushed more this way now that the urban-rural split is becoming more pronounced kind of everywhere, where today we see there's such a kind of almost precise tracking, right, to like how urbanized a place is to sort of how Democratic or Republican is as compared to how it used to be. So that's something I'm actually interested in following this, which is how has Kansas's how have Kansas's cities, right, particularly the ones that other than Kansas City, how have they kind of developed over the last decade or more in terms of their politics and their relationship to the rest of the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so just to set the stage for this a little bit, most of Kansas's population resides in about 5 counties in the state. So we have 105 counties. About 2/3 of the population is between 5 and 7 counties. 3 of those actually being, right outside of Kansas City. My county, Sedgwick County, which is where Wichita is, being another one. Topeka, which is Shawnee County. So a lot of them are along the northeast I-70 corridor, and then of course Sedgwick County, where Wichita is. And so we've seen those counties grow as especially younger populations have moved from rural areas to the cities. And at the same time, we've seen that younger populations are becoming more and more liberal for the most part. And so that is part of the trend that we're seeing here in Kansas that we see in other states as well. And I'll talk a little bit about Wichita because I think it's a good example of this, where Wichita still is, or still has, I should say, very Democrat and very Republican communities within the city. But we're seeing more and more so the city of Wichita as a whole is becoming more liberal, is moving more to the left. So in 2021, we saw the city council of Wichita. We have nonpartisan races for city council, so I want to preface that. But a majority of the members of the city council are self-proclaimed Democrats, or in this case, actually self-proclaimed progressives. And also a majority of them are now under the age of 40. So they're millennials. And so they are younger people. And a lot of people don't realize that about Wichita. And so we're seeing similar trends here in Wichita now that we've seen in the Kansas City suburbs over the last 10 years or so. We're starting to see that play out here. Our rural communities in Kansas are losing their young people, mostly because of lack of jobs, lack of opportunities for those young people. They're moving either out of state, or if they're staying in Kansas, they're moving to Wichita or Sedgwick County They're moving to Lawrence or the Kansas City suburbs. And so a lot of that in-state migration is to these larger cities. And so part of it is also that, these younger populations tend to be demographically more diverse. So when it comes to race, for example, they're more likely to be Latino, more likely to be Black citizens, et cetera. But also just young people in general are more likely to be liberal. And that's true in Kansas, but also across the United States, and across Western democracies in general, some recent studies show. And so we're seeing those similar trends right here in Kansas that we've seen in Kansas City for a long time and also just across the country.
I'm curious, because I do in a moment want to get to the questions of like the GOP supermajority and those things, but your mentioning of how young some of these places are, particularly how young some of their actual political representation is, makes me wonder. In Arkansas, we deal a ton with brain drain. There is just a lot of, you can study it in the data, but you can also just kind of feel it in the conversation. There's a lot of young people who they might feel like there's a place for them in the sort of Northwest Arkansas area. Some of them are happy to stick around Central Arkansas, Little Rock area, but a lot of them express right dissatisfaction, and you can kind of feel that pull. So I guess what I'm curious about is in this context, what's the kind of feeling in Kansas about retaining younger people? Is there a sense that it can be done? Are there success story areas? And then also sort of, is there a sense among younger people in Kansas that it's worth sticking around? I know that's a big question, and obviously you can go to polling data, but I'm also curious, just from you as a Kansan and a younger academic professional living in Kansas, how it feels to you.
Yeah, so I hear a lot from my students in particular, most of who, at this point in time are Gen Z, who are, traditional college students, that they maybe don't see opportunities for themselves here. Or if they do, it's specifically in Wichita or specifically in Kansas City. But we have seen the state of Kansas, so a lot of our policies in the last, 10 years or so have started to try to target young people and have tried to keep them here. So we have a lot of rural development going on across the state. And we also have certain areas that are zoned for young people. Essentially, if they move into that community, they get a job and they stay there for a certain number of years. They get a little bit of student loan forgiveness. Essentially, the state will pay off some of their student loans and things like that, particularly for really important parts of the job sector, like teachers that we have shortages of, et cetera. So we have seen the state of Kansas recognize that they are having some of this brain drain and trying to combat that in different ways. Is that entirely successful? I wouldn't say yes, and I probably wouldn't say no either. I think for some people it is successful in getting them to stay when maybe they wouldn't have. But for some people, that's not the type of life that they want. That's not the type of community they want to live in. And they just see more opportunities for themselves elsewhere. And so even though those opportunities are available, they're going to leave the state and go somewhere else, or they're going to move to Wichita or move to Kansas City. It's really hard for a lot of rural Kansas counties to keep their populations, particularly even over the last couple of years since COVID. We've seen closing of rural hospitals, some consolidation of rural schools, et cetera. And all of those things contribute to young people not wanting to stay there. But we do see the state putting in some policies to try to combat that. And so I still think it's really too early to tell one way or another whether that's going to be successful.
I think on that note, I want to dig deeper into a particular subset of young people. I know that a trans healthcare bill failed last year to override Governor Kelly's veto, but that there is a new bill in the works in the Kansas legislature this year, which again, like you said, has retained its supermajority, and it does something that I think is worrying. That not actually all of these trans healthcare bills do, but some of the most pernicious ones do, which is it targets people, not only people under 18, but 21 and under. And I'm curious about how younger people in the LGBTQ community feel about their status in Kansas. Because, I mean, it is significant that Governor Kelly was able to veto and that veto was able to be sustained. But clearly there's another effort, there's another push, and something like restricting even adults, legal adults, access to transition or gender affirming healthcare seems like a pretty extreme step. So I was wondering if you could, again, because you're working on a college campus, probably have some insights into that.
Yeah, I don't know what the data itself says on that, so I want to preface with that. But just kind of normatively or anecdotally, I have heard from lots of students here at WSU, particularly members of the LGBTQ plus community, that they don't feel like Kansas is a safe place for them to live. We did see yesterday the LGBTQ caucus in the Kansas House introduced a bill that would add LGBTQ individuals and veterans to the state anti-discrimination law. So that could be, a step to try to combat that. But laws like these that are coming out of the state legislature, those that persecute members of the LGBT community, certainly do not help the state's case when trying to get young people to stay here. And I would say that that's true for members who they themselves identify as LGBTQ plus, and also just other younger people in general, where they don't want to see, their friends or their family members going through, potentially their children eventually having to deal with that. So the state legislature is certainly not helping the case of trying to get young people to stay in the state when they produce laws like that.
I'm curious because this is a jumping off point that I find interesting for me when I ask this about other states as well, which is that Kansas is pretty interesting in its political history, and while maybe the most famous kind of examples of Kansas republicanism contemporarily are examples of the more extreme dimensions of the party, Chris Kobach and Brownback. Kansas has also pretty famously produced some. I don't know if I would describe them as altogether moderate, although Eisenhower was genuinely a moderate. But
Certainly.
even among its more conservatives, people who I think, for example, Bob Dole, who embodied a certain kind of moderation in temperament, at least in their approach to how politics ought to be practiced, even if not all of his actual policy prescriptions can necessarily be described as moderate. So I'm curious if the internal dynamics in Kansas politics still show any kind of affection among Kansas Republicans for that mode, if that explains any of the dynamics within some of its results, the abortion referendum, or even Governor Kelly's ability to win office twice, or if there's even just sort of cracks in the GOP coalition there, or if like in other states we've kind of talked about, if that version of the Kansas GOP is essentially dead.
I definitely do not think that version of the Kansas GOP is dead. And especially if we look at even the abortion amendment from last fall, we can see that. And so we do have this long history and tradition in Kansas of being, Republican, but I don't necessarily believe that that means the same thing as conservatism. And so we certainly have Republicans that are conservative, but there is this strong libertarian kind of undertone to Republicanism in Kansas that is still really strong even today. So libertarian candidates themselves don't do well here, mostly because third parties don't do well anywhere in the United States because of our electoral system. But when you have Republican candidates that have more kind of libertarian-esque policies, they tend to do better in elections. And I think today we would label those as moderate Republicans, even though there's a little bit different flavor there. And so one of the things that we saw in that abortion amendment last fall was we know that a huge number of Republicans voted no on that constitutional amendment. And it's not even necessarily because they themselves are pro choice. but they specifically don't want the government making that decision. That's a lot of the discussion that we heard around that amendment last year. We also saw an amendment on the November ballot that would give the state legislature more power over the executive branch. That also failed, though by a slim majority, a slim majority. And so we do see these really strong libertarian streaks still in Republican politics in Kansas. And because of that, we see a lot of infighting between the Republican Party, especially those in the state legislature. So while we do have Democrats, of course, in our state legislature, the real partisan fighting that happens in Topeka is not between Republicans and Democrats. It's between moderate Republicans who form coalitions with the Democrats versus more conservative members of the Republican Party. And so while the Republicans have a supermajority, they still often fail to override governors' vetoes. They fail to pass some of these really kind of strong conservative, more culture war type of bills. And it's because they cannot get those more libertarian, those more moderate Republicans on board. And so the real fighting in Topeka is between members of the Republican Party themselves and not between Republicans and Democrats.
I find that really interesting also because Kansas being a state where you have a Democratic governor and a GOP supermajority, I assume, and you can elaborate if this is true or not, that a certain degree of that is gerrymandering. But at the same time,
Certainly.
I'm curious. Arkansas, for example, is just genuinely a deep red state. We do have gerrymandering in the state, but the reality is, while Governor Kelly won her races with plurality support, a Democratic statewide candidate in Arkansas is just not even going to get close enough to do that. That's simply not on the table right now in the state. So we have GOP supermajorities, and there's some gerrymandering, but they're also, frankly, pretty just reflective of where the state is at. Arkansas is a state right now where you just aren't going to get better than about 35% statewide support for a Democrat. Whereas in Kansas, the dynamics seem quite complicated, actually, where the state, on the one hand, does appear pretty red at the national level. And then at the same time, as you said, you have these fractures within the Republican Party. You have a Democratic governor. I'm curious about some of these dynamics. How much of a problem is gerrymandering at the moment in Kansas? And then also, how represented do Kansans feel by this current dynamic within the state government of a GOP supermajority, a Democratic governor who did get in essentially because there are third party candidates usually on the ballot, and that did help, right? She won with below 50% both times. But to me, that's a much more, I think, interesting and complicated political dynamic than, say, what we have here in Arkansas, which is just sort of much more straightforwardly deep red, or even in other states where I think you could say, like Wisconsin, which is genuinely a 50-50 state, and the Republican supermajority there is just blatantly a result of dramatic gerrymandering. And the Kansas case seems to be not really either of those kinds of situations.
Yeah, so we certainly have gerrymandering, and we certainly do have a Republican majority in the state. So if we look at voter registration data, we have more citizens who are registered as Republicans and who are registered as unaffiliated, so independents, than we do Democrats. So Democrats are certainly the minority of registered voters. And we do have gerrymandering. And so in 2010s, the last time that we redistricted, there was, again, partisan infighting between the Republican Party. And so we actually had a panel of judges make some of those district decisions in 2010. So now that we've redistricted again, we've gotten rid of some of the more moderate districts. And so we do have gerrymandering in Kansas, just like we see in most states across the country who don't have a very specific nonpartisan process for redistricting. But one of the things that is really difficult is that, especially the Kansas City suburbs, where a vast majority of Kansas population is concentrated, is just becoming more and more Democratic. And so there's very little that can be done there to gerrymander some of those districts. And so what we've seen, rather than trying to draw Republican majority districts in an area where there is not a Republican majority, is drawing safer Democratic districts where they're not purple anymore, they're solid blue, to make some other districts that are on the outskirts of that more safe for Republicans. So we certainly do see gerrymandering for a partisan benefit or advantage, but just the way that our population is grouped in Kansas makes it a little bit more difficult to do, because we have, this blue Johnson County and Wyandotte County and Douglas County area. That's harder to gerrymander at the state level. So for our state legislative districts, it is easier, however, for congressional districts. And there was a lawsuit last year about the Kansas 3rd Congressional District, which is those Kansas City suburbs, where for the first time in a long time, they had split part of Wyandotte County in half. So we have this trend in Kansas where we try not to split counties. We try to keep them whole within the congressional districts. And we saw for the first time in a long time that the northern part of Wyandotte County got separated from the southern part of Wyandotte County. And what essentially happened was it gerrymandered Black voters and Latino voters away from each other and put them into 2 separate congressional districts. And by doing that, it was thought that the Kansas 3rd Congressional District would be more of a purple district than it had been. So that's Sharice Davids's district. And it was thought that she would have a harder time in that race. And instead, she won by 12 points, and it wasn't even close. And part of that is just the demographic changes that we have seen in those suburbs over the last 5 or so years. A lot more young people moving in, a lot more highly educated people, and a lot more women moving into that area. And all 3 of those demographics tend to skew towards Democrats. Kind of the worst example of gerrymandering that we saw in congressional districts in Kansas was Lawrence, Kansas, which is where the University of Kansas is. It's sometimes called the People's Republic of Lawrence because it is so progressive and liberal, kind of similar to Fayetteville in Arkansas. Was scooped out of what it was formerly in the 2nd Congressional District and was put in the Big First. So we see all of those meatpacking cities in Southwest Kansas, like Dodge City, Garden City, Liberal, are now all in the same congressional district as Lawrence in Northeast Kansas. And really, if you look at the map, it goes all across Western Kansas, up across the north, scoops out Lawrence, and then goes back. And so Lawrence is really separated, and it's very obvious that that's a gerrymandered district. And so that essentially makes the voters in Lawrence to not have a voice in that congressional district, or for their voices to be drowned out. If we look at voter turnout data from last year, I've never seen this in an election before, but Douglas County, where Lawrence is, had higher voter turnout in the primary than it did in the general election. And that was really for that abortion amendment. But those same voters did not turn up to vote in the general election in November. Part of that has to do with young people caring more about issues than partisan politics, but also could be because they'd been gerrymandered into the Big First. Long term, I think, and there are some people who think that I'm wrong about this, and that's okay. But I think that putting Lawrence in the Big First could be a big mistake for Republicans in Kansas. So it's now in the same congressional district as Kansas State and Riley County, in Manhattan, the city of Manhattan. It's also, we're seeing some changes in the demographics of Southwest Kansas. They're very Latino, and they are also becoming increasingly young. And so we know that young people and Latinos tend to vote for the Democratic Party. And so not today or tomorrow, but maybe, 8 years from now, the first congressional district could potentially be at play for Democrats because of this short-term partisan gain of gerrymandering Lawrence into that Big First. There are people, including political scientists, who disagree with me on that. But that is my prediction of what I think is going to happen there. So we do have gerrymandering, but because such a large part of the state is so Republican and is so rural, it tends to play out in these very specific districts in these very small ways. And it's not as huge of a deal across the entire state like you see in some other places.
Really interesting. To run in a somewhat different direction, but to pick up, I think, because we've been talking around the rural parts of Kansas, and I do want to get at that, and also a little into your expertise on gun politics, which is not to paint with an excessively broad brush, but we have seen in the United States how some of a significant amount of the rise in kind of extreme rhetoric and even extreme politics has emanated from, or at least found gun groups helpful as an organizing force, gun rights advocacy groups. I'm interested, particularly in rural Kansas, about what you see going on there. I mean, I think certainly in Arkansas, we have some of that problem. I mean, um, we frankly, for us, just because we're so already Republican, we didn't see some of the things we saw, right, like in Michigan with the actual militia people showing up. But
Right.
that's not because that extremism doesn't exist here. It's just because they don't generally feel threatened by their state government in the same way. So I am curious about the development of some of those dynamics, perhaps within Kansas, especially within rural Kansas, especially as that divide grows, right? As that sense of distinctness between the rural part of the state and the cities in Wichita, Topeka, Kansas City grows.
Yeah, so gun owners in the United States are a huge portion of the highly participatory citizens. So they vote in larger numbers. They talk about politics more than non-gun owners. They're more likely to contact public officials, to donate money to campaigns, etc. And that is even more true in the rural parts of the country, and particularly the rural parts of the Great Plains. And so if you look at rural gun owners compared to non-rural gun owners, they're more participatory politically. And so because of that, we often see the voices of those gun owners over magnified in the national gun debate. And that is certainly true here in Kansas as well. One thing that I am always very careful to mention is that guns are normal and normal people own guns. So we tend to think about gun owners, at least
I'm glad
liberals
you
and
said
progressives.
that. As an
Yeah,
Arkansan, I'm glad you said that because I always have to dispel that with some of my friends who aren't from this part of the country. Like, it does not freak me out to go into someone's home and see a gun. That is not by itself in any way a problem.
right. Yeah, so I consider myself a gun scholar, right? And one of the prominent gun scholars, his name is David Yamani. He is at Wake Forest in North Carolina, and he has really coined this phrase that guns are normal and normal people own guns. And so we tend to think of, when we think of gun owners, we think of the people in Michigan, right, who have this plot to overthrow the government and to kidnap the governor. But that is such a small fraction of gun owners. About 20% of gun owners are liberal, which is a small percentage. This is across the United States, which is a small percentage when you think about it as 20%. But that's 17 million people in the United States. That is not a small number. And so we tend to think of gun politics as being very partisan. And in some cases it is, right? Because the Republican Party has, for the last 10 years, has always had, excuse me, the last 30 years, not 10 years, has always had some sort of reference to the Second Amendment in their policy platform every year. And the Democratic Party does not have that, right? But when we look at actual gun owners, people who own guns, they're pretty diverse. So we tend to think of gun owners being older, male, white, conservative, but especially after 2020, gun owners are becoming increasingly diverse. They If we look at people who owned guns in or bought guns exclusively in 2020, a lot of them were first-time gun owners. They were women. They were members of the LGBTQ plus community. They were Black and Latino, and so they're not this stereotype that we have of gun owners. And so we have to remember that that is going to change the political landscape around guns and gun politics and the participation of gun owners as well. And so while we do see that gun owners are more participatory in rural areas, which in the Great Plains, especially in like the Electoral College and the Senate, does give them a political advantage at the national stage when it comes to gun politics, we're seeing this demographic of people are increasingly becoming more diverse. And we don't yet know how that's really going to play out in politics. And so while, gun owners are an important part because they're so influential in American politics and certainly in Kansas politics, I don't think that it is accurate to say that that means it's going to be Republican or conservative, because so many people own guns and so many people own guns for various different reasons, self-protection, hunting, etc. And so I am in the camp that guns are normal and normal people own guns. And that's how we need to think about gun owners as participatory citizens within the American political system.
And yeah, a great answer and really good data as well, and really helpful, right? Because I mean, I think that we've seen specific aspects of gun politics become weaponized, right, in the kind of more extreme parts of Republican circles. But obviously, people were owning guns. Yeah, I think some of this is explainable. People were owning guns before 10 years ago, right? It's not like gun ownership is not a Russian psyop. It's a regular part of American culture. Um, that may feel a little more alien to people from particular parts of the country where it's not as common.
Certainly.
Um, this though, I do want to dig a little bit on the question of political extremism, and where it's radiating from, because one of the things I find interesting about Kansas in the broader American kind of political imagination is that even though it is a plain state, it has lots of rural areas. Kansas, more than other kind of states that might seem like it, I think tends to be viewed by a lot of Americans as a kind of political crossroads, in a way that's distinct, right? Like no one really looks at Arkansas or at Oklahoma, nearby states to Kansas, right, as in big indicators of broad American trends, right? Those are places that tend to follow trends rather than to be kind of in any way sort of leading indicators. Whereas I think Kansas gets put in that category with states like Missouri, whether this is still true or not, and others that are kind of viewed as having some bellwether qualities. So I'm interested if what you see right now in Kansas, given, we just had a midterm election where, to some degree, extremist candidates were rejected. I'm always a little bit hesitant when people say that because I tend to think, well, over 100 people who denied the election were reelected to Congress. So, I don't consider that moderate. At the same time,
right,
some headlining candidates who ran very explicitly right on things like election denial and conspiratorial politics were rejected. And in that spirit of thinking about Kansas as a place that can really offer up some insights, maybe to the broader body politic of the United States, I would love to know a little bit about how you feel about how that played out in the state of Kansas itself in 2022, both statewide and maybe local candidates. If you have thoughts or examples of places where we might draw hope, or places where we might have good reason to still be pretty apprehensive.
Yeah, so in Kansas, I agree that it is this really good example of a state that's at a crossroads. And I think part of that comes from the historical and the political legacy that still exists in Kansas. And so we have this strong value of individualism because of the legacy of the frontier and western expansion. But Kansas itself is also considered what we call a moralistic state. And in moralistic states, we know that people look to government to solve problems, and to make people's lives better. And in that regard, it is very different from other states in the Great Plains. And the reason that it's categorized as a moralistic state really has a large amount to do with the types of people who immigrated to the United States and then ended up in Kansas, brought some of those values with them from where they came from. There's a really good book called The American Mosaic by Elazar that anyone can read if they're more interested in this. But so Kansas really has this moralistic political culture, but also this strong legacy of individualism because people used to come here and settle and then be self-reliant and have to be because there are no cities, and their neighbors are miles and miles away, etc. And so I think that is really what puts Kansas at such a crossroads, is because we have these combating and these conflictual political values here. And we see that play out in elections. So we, of course, have a Democratic governor. One of the things that we saw in 2022 was the way that Laura Kelly got elected was straight out of the Kansas Democratic Party playbook. She did not talk about herself as a Democrat. She talked about herself as middle of the road. Her very first political ad was actually a drone shot of her literally walking down the middle of a road in rural Kansas. And so a lot of that type of framing of some of these people are more extreme. I am here, middle of the road. I'm going to represent Kansans, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And Laura Kelly did that really well. Sharice Davids also did that really well in the 3rd Congressional District. And so we see that Democrats who frame themselves as moderates can really pull both this idea of a moralistic state where government is good and is supposed to help people, and also still hold on to this individualism that a lot of Kansans have. And that is a lot harder to do when you're at one side of a political party, whether that be Democrat or Republican. We did see, I think, one of the most interesting races in Kansas that did not get a lot of attention last year was our attorney general race. The attorney general race, where we had Chris Kobach against Chris Mann. Chris Kobach has this, pretty long history at this point of being a little bit more extremist, of, doing some wild things that put him even at odds with the Kansas Republican Party. And he won his race, but he nearly lost, and it was closer than it should have been, to a candidate that most people have never heard of. Chris Mann is a Democrat. He lives in Lawrence. He's really only well known in Northeast Kansas. And that race went uncalled for a really long time. And so theoretically, and for what we know about Kansas politics, the more well-known candidate should, in this case, Chris Kobach, should have blown Chris Mann out of the water. But because his political baggage, it was a lot closer than it should have been. And so while we did see him getting reelected, and he has a long history of, I will just say, problematic stances when it comes to voter suppression and voter turnout and registration, et cetera, that have no basis in reality, he almost lost to a candidate that no one had ever heard of. And part of that is because Kansans generally tend to reject extremism in various forms. And they certainly had some inclinations to do so there. I think the most interesting voters, and I would just love to sit down and talk with them, are people who voted for Laura Kelly, but also voted for Chris Kobach for Attorney General, because those two things seem to not make a lot of sense. And so seem to be conflictual, I guess, when it comes to policies. But we do see this long legacy in Kansas of people liking government and wanting government to help and make their lives better and to represent the people. And that really goes against extremism in a lot of different ways.
That's I think, a great and really fascinating excavation of Kansas politics. So here, as we're closing out, I think I always ask people to give me a sort of favorite recommendation from their neck of the woods, as a kind of nod to our affection for less considered or less focused on places. And that can be anything, favorite restaurant, favorite museum, national park, state park, old theater that you like, anything. So I'm curious for you, if someone's in Wichita for a weekend or a week, what you would say is at least one, if you got more than one point, but at least one kind of like thing they would have to check out.
Yeah, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and I'm going to give you two. I'm going to give you one in Wichita and one in the Wichita area. So in Wichita, I would say check out Old Cowtown Museum. It is an outdoor living history museum here in Wichita. They brought in buildings from all over the area. They have historical reenactors who are volunteers, who, pretend to be metalsmiths or who are pretending to be teachers. They have gunfights, fake gunfights, of course. And it's just a really cool experience to go and see what Wichita used to look like. Um, and so I love going there. I think I've been there 4 or 5 times at this point, and I've only lived here 3.5 years, and two of those were pandemic years. So clearly I like it a lot. And then the Wichita area one, I would say one of the best kept secrets in this area is a restaurant in Yoder, Kansas called Carriage Crossing, which is an Amish restaurant. Actually, Yoder is a big Amish town. And they have the best fried chicken I've ever had. And also the pies are amazing. So go get yourself a nice meal. And then, make the 40-minute drive. It's worth it. And then go check out Old Cowtown Museum in Wichita.
Food and entertainment, dinner and a show. That's a pretty solid recommendation. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for listening, and we hope that you'll be back for the next one. Dr. Alex Middlewood, thank you so much for being with us. Her piece, Kansas is Bleeding but Not Broken, Disintegrating Democracy in the Free State, can be read at pulaskiinstitution.org. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, bye. The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.